Hello and welcome back. I'm Dr. Mark D. Baldwin, and this is AML 2020, American Literature 2. Today we're going to discuss one of America's very finest novelists, William Faulkner. I'm quite certain you can find some people who will disagree, but many scholars contend that among American authors, only Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville are in Faulkner's league. In a prose style unlike any other, Faulkner created a massive body of work, distinguished not only for its literary qualities, but for the breadth and depth of its engagement with the human condition. Perhaps his most impressive achievement is that he created an entire world, or what Balzac called a cosmos in miniature. Constructing one archetypal county in the American South from the days of Indian possession through the Civil War to the early 20th century, Faulkner populated it with over 1,100 characters who mix and mingle throughout all of his stories. Taken all together, his novels and stories transcend literature and rise to the level of cultural artifact, a living, breathing chronicle of the South's soul and soil, its socio-historical reality. Mere history books pale in comparison to the authentic flavor and feel of Faulkner's moving, soaring saga. Faulkner's own family epitomized the fate of the South. Once prominent and proud, they suffered a progressive generational decline into poverty and disrepair. His great-grandfather was a politician and colonel, his grandfather a lawyer, his father a livery stable owner. Born in 1897, Faulkner entered the Southern world in its doldrums, wallowing in a decadent 30-plus-year slide downhill from defeat in the Civil War. As heredity and environment are wont to do with both artists and mere earthbound mortals, they profoundly affected Faulkner's perception of the world and influenced his selection of subject matter and themes. Of the Southern aristocrat's world of faded glory, Faulkner admired its courage, gallantry, and code of conduct, but deplored the slavery system upon which it was built. Ultimately, he saw the South as a tragedy, doomed by its fatal flaw. To be perfectly clear, Faulkner was born in the Bible Belt, into segregated white society. The tenets of his strict Calvinist-directed Christian faith were strained and twisted by the racism all around him. How could the idea of all men as brothers and equal in the eyes of the Lord be reconciled with the bigoted, double-standardized, violently derogatory attitude and actions of his fellow whites toward blacks? They couldn't. Thus, Faulkner labored under a horrible moral dilemma, not unlike Huck Finn's. Whose side should he take? His societies and families, or God's? Faulkner often played out this tragic dilemma through stories tortured by the Christian drama of sin, guilt, and redemption. As many critics accuse him, Faulkner may well have been a racist, but he knew that about himself. He hated being so, and he struggled his entire life to overcome this inherited, ingrained malignancy. These struggles found their literary shape in the characters and character of one small county in Mississippi that Faulkner named Yoknapatawpha. By the time he was 30 years old, Faulkner had sketched in his mind an entire mythological superstructure for his microcosmic southern county. Apropos for the pathos of his people, who include aristocrats, carpetbaggers, college boys, lawyers, clerks, farmers, bums, saints, sinners, gangsters, conmen, ladies, whores, gentlemen, bastards, and all varieties of blacks, who collectively are his best human beings. Faulkner's stories, if segregated, fall short of adequately representing either the South in its entirety or the brilliance of his talent. However, taken all together, integrated if you will, the stories create a patchwork quilt larger than life, greater than mere literature. They rise to an epic mythic status, no less an artistic achievement than Homer's The Iliad and the Odyssey, or Milton's Paradise Lost. Some of Faulkner's major novels include The Sound and the Fury. This story of the decadent Compson family chills with its psychological violence. As They Lay Dying, you can read more about in my link to the article I wrote that was published in the Faulkner Journal. It's a dark comedic tragedy of subnormal poor whites. Sanctuary is a sadistic horror story that traces the corruption of small-town youth and the power of crime in the Prohibition era. Light in August is a story of forbidden love that violently pits black against white, man against woman. And Absalom records the downfall of the aristocratic Sutpin dynasty in a non-chronological, irrational narration. Some of Faulkner's major themes include man's capacity for evil. This Calvinistic position that man is evil contends that sinfulness must be expiated. Images of collapse and disintegration illustrate the moral paralysis and spiritual desolation and sterility suffered by many of his characters. As Faulkner put it in his 1950 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he is concerned mainly with the human heart in conflict with itself. The writer's duty is to write about man's soul and his capacity for endurance and compassion and sacrifice. Thus, Faulkner engaged in a constant struggle against defeatism, negativism, cynicism, and pessimism. He stressed his faith in the human heart's ability to triumph over the failings of the modern human condition: greed, injustice, fear, cowardice, and duplicity. How a man reacts to the negative forces of life is how he should be measured. These aspects are portrayed in images of fortitude and indomitability. Life is essentially meaningless, but man must be reconciled to his fate. A man's handling of his fate becomes his reason for being. As I mentioned at the outset, Faulkner's work chronicles the decline of the South due to its fatal flaw, or original sin, if you will, of slavery, which itself represents the universal of humanity's struggle against outrageous and blind circumstance. Faulkner transforms local social history as the record of the human spirit. Primitivism versus civilization informs much of Faulkner's work. His ethical system is grounded in a romantic hatred of modern civilization, which he feels has destroyed much of the essential goodness of natural man. The mechanistic forces of modern industrialization have helped destroy the environment while dehumanizing the individual. Thus, Faulkner admires those who live close to the land, feeling that slaves and the sons and daughters of slaves have inherited the South and have a greater birthright to its land because they worked it. In fact, the heart of essential human values can be found in Faulkner's black characters. The Negroes, even the ones the whites call niggers, are the ones with the most goodness, charity, endurance, integrity, courage, and pride. Faulkner loves nature and could almost be called a pioneering environmentalist. From the transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau, Faulkner inherited his pantheistic view that God is in nature, and that those who exploit nature, both man's and the world's, are the real evil people. These pure exploiters own things and attempt to treat the earth and other men as objects. But the rape of nature and the exploitation of man is always avenged. The exploiters always destroy themselves, for man's nature is, after all, original sin, which can only be redeemed through love of others and of nature. Faulkner embraced a new and different conception of time itself, posited by the philosopher Bergson, that time is, and if there is no such thing as was, then there is no such thing as will be. That time is not a fixed condition. Time is, in a way, the sum of the combined intelligence of all men who breathe at that moment. No man is himself. He's the sum of his past. The past is. Many of Faulkner's narratives take the reader into a dimension free of space and time through his use of multiple fragmented voices in a variety of unannounced and often inexplicable non-chronological sequences, themselves interrupted by flashbacks and flash-forwards. Since we've segued into that subject, a few words about Faulkner's style are in order. Many people who say they don't like Faulkner often cite his style as the main reason. Steeped in the Southern tradition of oratory, Faulkner's prose is complex and dense. He doesn't narrate or report a scene. He renders it in an impressionistic fashion, often referred to as stream of consciousness, a barrage of long sentences and abstract words, illogically constructed by a free association of images and the projection of events through the memory or consciousness of characters in the form of interior monologue. Faulkner's vocabulary strains the bounds of the ornate romanticism to which it constantly alludes. Like life, his prose is paradoxical, appearing at first glance to be rambling and unsettling, a flood of adjectives, two words merged into one, a series of negatives followed by a positive, numerous synonyms for repetition. Yet upon admission and acceptance, it makes perfect sense as a way to represent in writing the chaotic reality of life's multiple perspectives, interminable ironies, and incorrigible resistance to simplistic terms. Perhaps paramount, and yet rarely mentioned, is Faulkner's mastery of suspense through his style. He narrates effects in a dizzying flow of details, invariably suspending the reader's recognition and the plot's resolution through a seemingly endless chain of signifying clues dropped almost randomly by various voices from various times and places. Let's conclude this lecture with a few remarks about your reading selection, As I Lay Dying. As I Lay Dying is Faulkner's statement that men cannot live as automatons without traditional virtues. If man doesn't live with dignity, self-respect, responsibility, and love, he'll go the way of the Bundrans. This quintessential modern novel is an absurdly comedic, mythic journey to bury a family matriarch that echoes the Israelites' trek out of Egypt to the Promised Land, or the medieval pilgrimage of souls to salvation. The novel includes images from Revelation, which describe the apocalypse, an epic flood, a doomsday fire. Some questions to consider as you read As I Lay Dying are as follows. Is the novel a tragedy, comedy, or both? Try to identify and consider the novel's existential elements. Review the notes in the O'Neill lecture. Identify and consider the novel's modernist elements. Please review the notes in the 20th century lecture. And consider as many of the characters and their viewpoints as you can from a variety of critical perspectives. I know that's a lot to ask, so you might try reducing your considerations to 3 or 4 of the characters who interest you most. To give you the flavor of the story and Faulkner's masterful style, I'd like to read you a few passages from Addie's only chapter. Addie's the mother, the one dying. Yet she has only one chapter, almost in the exact center of the book, starting in our text on page 1594. Note, as I read, Annie's cynicism and bitterness as she ruminates on many ideas about love, existence, and the meaning and purpose of our little lives here on earth. I'll be skipping a few paragraphs here and there, but I'll tell you as I do so. So please get out your text and turn to page 1594. Are you ready? Let's begin. In the afternoon, when school was out, and the last one had left with his little dirty snuffling nose, and instead of going home, I would go down the hill to the spring where I could be quiet and hate them. It'd be quiet there, with the water bubbling up and away, and the sun slanting quiet in the trees, and the quiet smelling of damp and rotten leaves and new earth, especially in the early spring, for it was worse then. I could just remember how my father used to say that the reason for living was to get ready to stay dead a long time. And when I would have to look to them day after day, each with his and her secret and selfish thought, and blood strained to each other, blood and strange to mine, and think that this seemed to be the only way I could get ready to stay dead, I would hate my father for having ever planted me. I would look forward to the times when they faltered, so I could whip them. When the switch fell, I could feel it upon my flesh. When it welted and ridged, it was my blood that ran. And I would think with each blow of the switch, now you are aware of me. Now I'm something in your secret and selfish life, who've marked your blood with my own forever and ever. I'm going to skip about 10 paragraphs here, down to the one that begins, so I took ants. So I took ants. And when I knew that I had cash, I knew that living was terrible, and that this was the answer to it. That was when I learned that words are no good. Words don't ever fit, even when they're trying to say it. When he was born, I knew that motherhood was invented by someone who had to have a word for it, because the ones that had children didn't care whether there was a word for it or not. I knew that fear was invented by someone that had never had the fear, pride who had never had the pride. I knew that it had been, not that they had dirty noses, but that we had had to use one another by words like spiders dangling in their mouths from a beam, swinging and twisting and never touching, and that only through the blows of the switch could my blood and their blood flow as one stream. I knew that it had been, not that my aloneness had to be violated over and over each day, but that it had never been violated until cash came, not even by ants in the nights. He had a word, too. Love, he called it. But I had been used to words for a long time. I knew that word was like the others, just a shape to fill a lack. That when the right time came, he wouldn't need a word for that any more than for pride or fear. Cash did not need to say it to me, nor I to him, and I would say, let ants use it if he wants to. So it was ants or love or ants. Didn't matter. I'm going to skip a few more paragraphs down to the one that begins, he did not know. He did not know that he was dead then. Sometimes I'd lie by him in the dark here in the land that was now my blood and flesh, and I would think, ants. Why ants? Why are you ants? I would think about his name until after a while I could see the word as a shape, a vessel, and I would watch him liquefy and flow into it like cold molasses flowing out of the darkness into the vessel until the jar stood full and motionless, a significant shape profoundly without life, like an empty door frame. Then I would find that I had gotten the name of the jar. I would think the shape of my body, where I used to be a virgin, is in the shape of a... I couldn't think ants. Couldn't remember ants. It was not that I could think of myself no longer a virgin, because I was 3 now. And when I would think Cash and Darrell that way until their names would die and solidify into shape and then fade away, I would say, all right, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter what they call them. And so when Cora Tull would tell me I was not a true mother, I would think how words go straight up in a thin line, quick and harmless, and how terribly doing goes along the earth, clinging to it, so that after a while the 2 lines are too far apart for the same person to straddle from one to the other, and that sin and love and fear are just sounds that people who never sinned nor loved nor feared have, were what they never had and cannot have until they forget the words, like Cora, who could never even cook. Well, in the interest of saving time, I'm going to pause there, stop the reading. I'd like to read the whole book to you, actually. It's a terrific story, isn't it? And beautifully written prose.